So if we do sort of jump forward from Babylon to later Jewish and Greek texts, then we start to think about how these ideas were transmitted at the time of the Second Temple, Jewish apocalyptic literature. Here we have a fragmentary version of Enoch. This isn't the main text of Enoch, but certain fragments that exist give this rendering that the archangel Uriel is over the world and Tartarus. That's the domain of this particular archangel. Now, now that's a really intriguing concept. Nick, what do you make of that?
Um, so actually, this kind of goes back to Josephus, that little excerpt that I read from Josephus. If you'll notice, so Uriel um, is the name of an angel, and Josephus says that the angels are guardians over those who go to Hades. Now, there's a bit of a difference between, different texts say different things about Tartarus, but essentially, according to Hesiod, and we've looked at Hesiod already. Hesiod essentially says that it is like the deepest, furthest extremity of Hades. And so, and actually, according to Hesiod, who's housed there, regular people are not kept there. Instead, the Titans are kept there. And we spoke of the Titans in the last Jewish and Greek meeting that we had. So it's essentially a part of Hades, but it's for these Titans who rebelled against the gods, according to Hesiod.
Sort
So
of demigods that rebelled against
that's
other
right.
gods
That's
and
exactly right.
are
Yep,
punished in Tartarus. Yeah.
that's right. Um, yeah, interesting that the archangel's name is Uriel, right? Because it's supposed to be dark in this area,
Yeah.
uh,
Hmm.
and uh, and the name means Ur in Hebrew is light. God is light. Uriel, my God is light.
Yeah,
So
a very
yeah,
interesting name. That's a good point. And
yeah.
also interesting that the world and Tartarus are grouped together as a domain.
Very
Um,
interesting. Yeah, it goes to what Cindy was saying, which, by the way, was incredibly fascinating. I could have just sat here all day listening to that.
yes.
Um, but right, so the idea is that the underworld is part of the world. I mean, Josephus even says it. That is this is part of not some far flung, to use a Latin phrase, not some far flung intermundia. That is, this
Hmm.
not it's not a space between worlds that is like a fourth dimension or something like that. I mean, it's actually built. It's part of the world. It's part of topography. It's part of geography.
Hmm.
And so it's interesting that the world and Tartarus
Mm-hmm.
are put together here,
Mm-hmm.
because they literally, one is sits on the other, as it
Yeah.
were.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
Um, on that note, just to pick up on what you were saying, or Cindy, were you going to jump in there?
No, I was trying to think of the different references that I've heard, and so maybe I shouldn't be bringing this up without references that I can point directly to, but that there is the ancient concept that the roots of the mountains go down like to that underworld, right? That
Hmm.
it's another bit of
Wow.
the connectivity aspect of understanding if the mountains are holding up the sky, that there's like the roots of the mountains are holding down below. But I don't have the
That's
exact
cool.
references, so you can take that for what it's worth.
Yeah, that is fascinating. And of course, mountains in
Yeah,
the ancient mindset were often associated with the gods, as you mentioned, in all sorts of cultures. I mean, you have
right.
in the Greek cities, they would go up and view the top of the mountain as a place dedicated to gods. You have
Yep.
in Exodus the mountain of God as well. Again, very similar idea with a bit of a twist,
Yep.
as we often find in the Hebrew Bible. But just picking up on this, still from Enoch. Um, the text says, I then proceeded from that area to another place which is even more terrible, and saw a terrible thing, a great fire that was burning and flaming. So here I think we can put together a few things that we've been talking about already. So I believe at this point he's in Sheol, um, but going from that place to another place which is even more terrible. A great fire that was burning and flaming. Then Uriel, one of the holy angels who was with me, responded and said to me, "This place is the prison house of the angels who have sinned." That's implied there. They are detained here forever. Now, before I throw it back to Nick, because I know he'll have lots of stuff to say here and tie everything together that we've been talking about, I just want to emphasize that this is Jewish literature written in Greek. So this is not Greek mythology anymore. It's Jewish literature founded on the culture and literature of the Hebrew Bible here in the 3rd or 2nd century BCE, using the Greek language and therefore Greek concepts like Hades and Tartarus and so forth to express a vision that is supposed to fit into the Hebrew biblical understanding and mindset and approach. So how is Enoch doing all of that, Nick? I mean, even in just this short text, there's a lot going on.
Yeah, there certainly is. What are some of the Hebraic roots of some of this material? Well, as I read a great fire that was burning and flaming, when it comes to the afterlife, really the only place that you're going to get this with any level of clarity is going to be at the end of Isaiah. So if you read Isaiah 65 and 66, it's Isaiah's vision essentially of, for lack of a better term, right, the new renewed world. God says in Isaiah, "I'm going to make a new heavens and a new earth." And of course, Revelation, the writer of Revelation, recycles that language. And in the midst of this new heaven and new earth, we get at this renewed earth, renewed heavens, in which the righteous of God live for eternity. So, in 1st century or Second Temple terms, we could be thinking in terms of like a post-resurrection scenario. And there's an interesting text right at the end in chapter 66, and it's sort of, Isaiah ends on sort of a downer in this description because it is essentially a place where those who have rebelled against God, it says, are put. And there is flame imagery here. Now, the Hebrew actually says the corpses of those who have rebelled against me, where the worm does not die and the fire is not quenched. Jesus actually cites this in Mark's gospel, talking about Gehenna or hell. So we can see this burning or this place of flame for corpses. And the vision there is that the people are dead. God has essentially, I suppose, killed them, to go back to 1 Samuel 2:6, that God kills and God makes alive. So those who have rebelled against God are killed and thrown into this ever-burning pit, essentially. And Jesus and other Jewish thinkers of his time, and we get this sort of fluttering around in 1st Enoch as well here, that's what they're thinking, and they're associating it with Gehenna. And so I would say that has to be the Hebrew foundation for the material that we're reading in 1st Enoch here.
Really interesting. Now, I know you're going to have more to say about the prison house of the angels, so I'll go on to the next slide,
Sure.
which is from 2nd Peter.
That's right. Yeah. So 2nd Peter discusses this very thing. So what 2nd Peter says is, God did not spare the angels when they sinned, but cast them to Tartarus. Actually, the Greek is a verb. It literally means to Tartusify, essentially. To
Yeah,
put in
so interesting.
So it's a verb. And these angels, says 2nd Peter, are confined to chains of gloom, and the Greek word for gloom is zophos. And these angels are kept in this area of gloom to be kept until the judgment. What's the judgment? It's that judgment day. It's that resurrection day. It's the God where it's the point where God judges the living and the dead, as it were. And so what 2nd Peter is doing is drawing on a Greek idea, that ends up in other Jewish literature as well. What's really interesting about this text is that, to go back to Hesiod, which I would imagine is the next slide, Hesiod uses the exact same Greek language as 2nd Peter. Now, 2nd Peter is written long after Hesiod is written. And so it seems that Second Peter is drawing on, this is where we get into the sort of blurry line between what's Jewish and what's Greek. Because, Second Peter is referring to these angels who sinned, which is likely, based on the context, a reference to Genesis chapter 6, in which the B'nai Elohim, the divine children of God, go leave heaven and have sexual relations with women on earth. We can talk about Genesis 6 in a second if you'd like. But that's probably what Second Peter is referring to. So taking a Judaic idea found in Israel's scriptures and essentially Greekifying it, or if you want, Hesiodifying it, because Hesiod says something very similar long before Second Peter was penned. Hesiod says, "It is just as far from heaven to earth as from the earth to murky Tartarus." And that is the nounal form, not the verb. That is where the Titan gods are hidden in gloom, in Zopho. It's the exact same Greek terminology that appears in Second Peter. So it's pretty clear that this writer of Second Peter is drawing on Hesiod, or at least drawing on tradition that is essentially initially reflected in Hesiod. Yeah.
Well, it seems to suggest, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but what springs to my mind is to think that these ideas about Tartarus and gloom and the gods, or demigods being locked up there for punishment, and in Greek mythology too, they committed a lot of sins, you could say, a lot of wrongdoing.
That's right.
So this mythology was very widespread in the culture of the time in the Greco-Roman world, and so it would seem like anyone who was writing in the first century and their audience would have been at least somewhat familiar with this idea of Tartarus and the Titans in gloom. And so when Peter says the angels were tartarized and put in gloom,
Tartarized is much better than tartarified or whatever I said. Tartarized. I love it.
well, when they were tartarized, when he says that, I mean, the audience must have been thinking of this Greco-Roman idea. Or would you agree with that? I mean, wouldn't that have immediately, rang some bells?
Absolutely. I don't see how you couldn't. For example, if I can read Second Peter in the 21st century and think of Hesiod, how much more so, to use a rabbinic phrase? This is a kol v'chomer argument that the rabbis would make. How much more so would a first century person reading in Greek think of Hesiod and think of the Titan gods and think of the gloom that Hesiod describes? So absolutely, yes. It shows us that notions of religious or theological notions in the ancient world there weren't hard and fast bifurcation lines between these two things. These ideas mesh together, and it doesn't get created in a vacuum. It gets created alongside, as Cindy said, topography, geography, but also culture. Right? You run into land and places. You also run into people. And it's in that kind of discourse, right, between different cultures and ideas that you get something like a synthesis that you see in the Judaic story in Second Peter being retold in Hesiod-esque language.
Really interesting. And that's kind of why I included this slide as well. We may have shown it before in a previous seminar, but it's a wonderful quotation from Jean Carmignac, who is an expert on Qumran in particular, and published a series as well on Hebrew translations of the Gospels, which is a really interesting topic in itself. But he had a comment that I think it was him. I think it was him who had the comment that if you haven't read the Gospels in Hebrew, you haven't read them at all, which is a really interesting and bizarre comment, because
that's chutzpahdik, as we say.
But an intriguing comment. But anyway, here he says Jewish Greek. So this combination of Jews writing in Greek to try to express concepts from Hebraic culture is a new language, a kind of Hebrew Greek, in which the Hebrew sky is reflected in the Hellenic mirror. I have a few more thoughts on that, but Cindy, let me just ask you to jump back in. I mean, as a reader of the Bible, what does this quotation say to you? Is it relevant for understanding texts like Second Peter, or for that matter, Matthew and John and others that we've been speaking about?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's, and we do this in all of our classes at IBC, is kind of is start to flesh out like where the deep roots of some of these ideas are coming from. And so we have two different things that are happening, right? Because we have the Israelite culture, language, religious practices, government that is morphing and changing into Judaism, which is morphing even more and changing because of the context of that Second Temple period. So we have all of this development that's going on within Judaism, and some of that, including some of the ideas that are getting woven in there, are coming from this massive onslaught of Hellenism that just kind of crashed into that Fertile Crescent area that we were talking about on the previous map. So when we get these ideas, Hellenistic ideas coming in from like with ushered in with Alexander the Great, and then it becomes the biggest, most massive cultural context that the Jews are living in, and they're still trying to establish their own identity, and they're preserving their history and their language, and but swarming all around them are all of these Greek ideas. And so we can see how they start to combine each other or combine with each other. Now, what I always think is interesting is for people who study Hebrew Bible and then push their ways into the Greek New Testament, you see very well the continuation of these Hebraic thoughts. For people who, like modern readers, a lot of people in the West are coming, we inherited kind of a Greco-Roman mindset. And when they read, or when we read into the New Testament, we see all the Greek ideas. And so to me, it's really interesting. Like, I think if people could learn this Jewish Greek idea, it would make reading the New Testament so much more fascinating because you start to, instead of just seeing the Hellenistic ideas, you see the development of these Israelite ideas that are coming, that are being held onto by the Jewish culture as well, which is then something really beautiful and something that often Western readers miss because they're not as familiar with these Jewish thoughts. But as soon as we put New Testament writings, Jewish writings next to like in their bigger context, we see so much more of the continuation of this Hebraic thought.
Thank you, Cindy. And I should have mentioned at the beginning that I also host the roundtable talks at the Israel Bible Center, and we have a lot of roundtable talks about topics like that, explaining the connection, explaining the things that are often missed, that come from the Hebrew culture, that are mixed from various cultures. And the roundtable talks are a collection of conversations with really leading world-renowned scholars and authors in biblical, Second Temple period, and Jewish Christian studies. So go to israelbiblecenter.com, take a look at the roundtable talks, take a look at Nick's articles and the other articles that are on the site, Israel Bible Weekly, listen to the podcast, and check out our courses as well, because all of the issues that we're touching on this evening or this afternoon, or this morning, wherever you are in the world, all of them are dealt with in a lot more detail in other materials that we have available. And I know some people in the questions were even asking, can we ask about other things, or asking somewhat tangential questions. We can't address all of that right now, in a limited format, limited time setting. But if you go to the website, I think you will find a lot of really useful information that will help you no matter what part of the Hebrew Bible or the New Testament or Second Temple period history or Jewish Christian relations you're looking at understanding better. But now I have a hard question for Dr. Shazer. Well, I think it's a hard question. Maybe you seem to have answers for a lot of hard questions. So maybe you have a good answer for this one too.
Well, we'll see. Okay. I'm ready.
Well, when I look at a quotation like this, so Jewish Greek is reflecting the Hebrew sky in the Hellenic mirror. And then I see an example like the one you gave us from 2 Peter. If we just go back to that here, tartarizing the angels and confining them to gloom. And then we look at the main Greek mythology, main formulation of Greek mythology, and you have the same thing even the same words used. So my question is this. I mean, Hesiod says Titan gods. Peter says angels who sinned, probably referring to Genesis 6, like you said, and literature that developed around Genesis 6, which we can also find in Enoch, for example, and Book of
Yes.
the Watchers, etc. So he's doing this, as you said, intentionally. He knows what these words mean in Greek. He's using them in a Jewish Greek context, maybe not with exactly the same meaning, but he knows the reference will be understood. So is he saying that the Greek Titans are equivalent to the Genesis angels who sinned?
Yeah, that is that's a very good question. So, Titan gods in Hesiod. So again, these Titans are divine beings, and and they're ultimately defeated. Zeus rises to supreme power at the end of Hesiod's theogony. Um, and so yeah, so these are literal divine beings. Um, in the Hebrew Bible, in Genesis chapter 6, it's the B'nai Elohim, which means the children of God. Um, and the Titans are children of the gods, according to Hesiod,
Right.
literally children.
Yeah.
And so the terminology, the idea is similar. Now, the difference is that there is no theogony. By the way, means the creation of the gods, how the gods are created. So Hesiod goes on and on and on. The whole text is devoted to how the gods are created. In the Hebrew Bible, there is no creation story of the gods. It just begins, as you rightly noted, Shaya, right? Bereshit bara Elohim. God just shows up creating things, but not the other gods. Um, and so there's a difference between the Greek mythology and the biblical narrative. At the same time, these are parallel enough ideas for Second Peter to be comfortable, essentially just transferring the material in Hesiod and Judaizing it, that is Israelifying it. I'm sorry for all of these clunky words, but the New Testament writers are quite happy to utilize ideas in Greek theology, but they're not underwriting every little aspect of that theology. Second Peter, the text, Peter doesn't believe that God, that there's this really complicated creation of the God story out there somewhere. He's not following that. However, he's happy to use language that shows up elsewhere because he knows exactly that people would have known that reference. And so on the one hand, it may be that someone who's, you have to remember the New Testament is a document for both Jews and Gentiles. And so someone perhaps who's not Jewish would want a kind of a calc, would want some training wheels. And you can think of these as sort of Greek training wheels for understanding the Hebrew biblical narrative.
Okay, really interesting. I'm not sure if you answered my question or not, but it is a
I'm not
hard
sure.
one.
I'm
I'll
not
give you
sure I
that.
answered your question either. Uh,
I don't have an
I,
answer either. So,
in a word, they're not exactly the same. They can't. The Titans and the Bnei Elohim in Genesis 6 can't be exactly the same because they come from disparate religious traditions, and they crop up independently. But by the time we get to the New Testament period, these traditions get incrementally closer as we go on, and they
Mhm.
ultimately essentially get married together in certain texts. Second Peter is a good example of that.
I will not press you on this. I'll leave it there. But I mean, some people would argue that ancient traditions that come from disparate cultures could originally go back to a common source, like flood stories, for example.
Yes, yeah. Sure. This is starting to sound like Eliada a bit from a theoretical perspective. The notion that everything is in common, and the axis mundi, the tree, the original tree goes back in so many different cultures that's really the tree of knowledge in Genesis. My view would be that yeah, certain things sound alike, but when you really drill down and you read things in the original languages and culture and context, they actually start to look more different than they do similar. But of course, you make a good point, Shai. There are different flood stories, and there are some similarities. It's very, very similar to what we're doing with Hesiod right now. In different cultures, we get Mesopotamian flood stories, for example. Yeah, they're a little bit like the Noah story, but there's way more different than there is similar if you actually read really, really closely. So.
Very interesting.
Shalom, I'm here to invite you to come with us on a journey of discovery into the Jewish context and culture that will forever change the way you read and interpret the Bible. As you slowly go through our self-paced, on-demand program in Jewish studies relevant for Christians, you will gain ability to discover the original meaning of the biblical texts. You will see the nuance hidden behind our best and faithful translations, and to interpret these ancient texts in their original meaning. At Israel Bible Center, we provide you with the state-of-the-art, simple-to-use technology. This way, you can study on your own from the comfort of your own home, even towards your certificate in the Jewish context and culture. This study will strengthen your ministry as you continue to serve God. We will guide you through our large collection of crash courses by our fascinating faculty and roundtable talks with leading world scholars. Our weekly Israel Bible magazine, as well as Israel Bible podcast that focuses on the land of Israel, will assist us along the way. We believe that the Bible does not need to be rewritten, but it needs to be carefully reread.
Click the link and register today to our wide variety of biblical courses.